What's up, YouTube? I'm David Warren. Welcome back to yet another video. In this video, I had the opportunity to interview Jon Lowrance CRNA. He is a practicing CRNA in Portland, Maine, and we had the opportunity to discuss his background as a CRNA, his educational preparation, and his application timeline and process to CRNA school. We also talked about mental health and mental well-being in providers. And then we also had an opportunity to talk about some wilderness medicine, which is a passion that we both enjoy. So without further ado, I'm going to jump over to Zoom where we're going to meet with Jon. All right, Jon, we are live. Thank you so much for joining me. I am really appreciative of you and your time and for setting some time aside to be able to do this. Just go ahead and introduce yourself. Tell me a little bit about you and kind of your practice as a CRNA.
Yeah, sounds good. So I'm Jon Lowrance, and I'm a CRNA in Portland, Maine. I work at a level 1 trauma center here in Maine. It's where I've worked since I got done with school. And I went to school at Western Carolina University in Asheville, North Carolina. I was a critical care nurse before that, of course. Started a podcast while I was in school. At the time, it was From the Head of the Bed. And that's evolved into Anesthesia Guidebook, which is still a project that I work on now.
Ah, nice, man. That's awesome. So you're currently in Maine right now. And so your job is at Maine Medical Center. Is that right?
That's correct.
Awesome. And about how long have you been a CRNA?
7 years, just
7 years.
It'd be seven years this summer. Yeah.
Nice. Okay. And so what made you want to become a CRNA? Tell me a little bit about, I guess, kind of like your nursing background and then kind of how your anesthesia timeline looked as far as like applying to school and what prompted you to want to go.
Yeah, for sure, man. So I think I probably got my start. I think the spark really got going in an 11th grade advanced first aid class, like in high school. Oh, nice. I took this course and I had like the keychain CPR mask. I got the extra large size. You could just put some gloves in there with it. And I thought that I was ready to absolutely save the world. I was lit. I was going for it. And, from there, healthcare wasn't like immediately apparent. I didn't have any context for healthcare in my life. So in college, I just went full tilt on like, pursue your dream, follow your passion. And for me, that was being outside and doing outdoor adventure stuff. So I found a degree in that. So my undergrad was in outdoor adventure leadership. But in that program, you have to take a wilderness medicine training. So I took a wilderness first responder course. Nice. And my instructors were emergency medical technicians. And I thought they were like the smartest people on the planet. They were gregarious. Awesome. They were sharp. They were talking about leadership and decision-making and judgment and, like owning a situation and, nice. Giving a shakedown on some sort of crazy, remote wilderness medical situation. So all I knew at that point in my life is that I wanted to come back and take an EMT course. I wanted to be like them. So after college, I started working as a guide and eventually became an EMT, started teaching wilderness emergency medicine courses. As an EMT basic, you can't really do a whole lot. You need to go on and do something, paramedic or flight nurse or something like that. So right. I knew I was going to be on a path. And fortunately, my paramedic friends, I was working EMS pre-hospital as an EMT basic, and all my paramedic friends said, you should go to nursing school. Being a paramedic is cool for a little bit, but after a while, like lights and sirens and emergency traffic isn't as sexy anymore when you're like 40 and you've got kids and a mortgage and you're still making, $15 an hour or whatever it was back then.
Makes sense.
And I had friends that were CRNAs at the time, and they had always kind of, put that bug in my ear. So I decided to go back to nursing school. And I can remember sitting in class the first day of school. It was like the stadium seating arena at St. Louis University, this big metro, nursing school with, 150 some odd students. I remember sitting there the first day of class. I didn't know anybody. It was a new city for me. And I'm like, I don't even know what a nurse does. I don't even I know they work in these environments and you can work in a helicopter if you want, but I don't really even know what they do. So so from there, I, got through nursing school, did one of the accelerated BSN programs, worked for about 5 years in a medical surgical ICU, figured out pretty quickly that I wanted to move on to anesthesia school. And towards the end of my time as a critical care nurse, I was ready to get out of there. and then went back to anesthesia school. But really, I mean, that's kind of the timeline. And really, I think the spark, the path was, the thing that kept me interested was I wanted to find myself in the moments where life really hangs in the balance for patients, as cheesy as that sounds. And I wanted, my preparation, my skill set, my knowledge base, my interaction with the other team members in the room to matter in those moments for patients. And so that remains like a driving force for me, is to, be prepared for those moments. And, as getting into anesthesia, probably 98% of what we do is routine, scheduled, elective, stable, straightforward. But, those absolute chaotic moments where the outcome is unknown, those are the moments that I live for, that I'm stoked about.
That's awesome, man. So kind of going back to your paramedic background, whenever you were doing that, you obviously knew at that point you wanted to pursue something a little higher, nursing, something in that regard. Did you know at that time you wanted to do anesthesia, or was it not until you got into nursing school that you're like, oh, hey, this is
Yeah,
probably something for me?
anesthesia was definitely on my mind. But again, I mean, I didn't really understand what I was getting into. I had friends that were CRNAs, and I was just an EMT basic. So I didn't go to paramedic school.
Got
All
it.
my
Okay.
paramedic friends said, you should, instead of going to paramedic school, I was making the decision between being a paramedic or going to nursing school. Like, you should go be a nurse. You could do pre-hospital if you want as a flight nurse. But so yeah, anesthesia was on my radar. I mean, I was making this kind of dramatic shift from being an outdoor guide and teaching wilderness medicine and a bunch of other risk management courses for outdoor educators, swiftwater rescue and I don't know, caving course and all kinds of stuff, to moving towards a career in healthcare. I had CRNA as kind of the end point, but I had never shadowed a CRNA. I didn't really know what that meant. But it was on the back of my mind when I was going to anesthesia school. So I talked to friends when I was in school. I was like, yeah, I'm thinking about going to CRNA school. And it was like, oh, that's cool. But none of us really had any idea what that meant,
Gotcha. Yeah. So whenever you were a critical care nurse, what was kind of the impetus that made you decide, anesthesia is the way or the path that I want to go versus some other path, or just staying a critical care nurse? Like, what was kind of that motive for you?
Yeah, I think it's the frustration of, you gain a certain level of knowledge in critical care, and what you want to do for your patients, but you're not trained enough, you're not skilled enough, you're not in an environment where you can see a problem and intervene and fix the problem, get the order set. Like, you have to go through this layer of the physicians who are working in the critical care unit, or if you're in a unit that's, run by PAs and nurse practitioners with physician support, you've got to go through these other channels to be able to make those decisions. And so I knew that I wanted to continue to go on. And I mean, critical care is thrilling. It's an amazing environment to work as an ICU nurse. And what I said about the underlying motive to like stand in that moment where life hangs in the balance, you probably do that in some ways, like in full on codes, way more in the ICU than you do in anesthesia, which is a good thing. I mean, you don't want to be coding people every day in the OR. Like, that usually means something went wrong, unless they're coming in as, traumas and that kind of stuff. And the saying goes is that, anesthesia is like a slow code on every patient. You're always resuscitating people and manage their airways and that kind of stuff. But as an ICU nurse, I mean, I think anesthesia is what a lot of critical care nurses want. They want one patient at a time. They want to focus in on the one thing in front of them, devote their whole attention to that. They want to have the scope of practice, the knowledge base, the autonomy, the latitude to be able to intervene for their patients and, in terms of like the maximal standard of care, the maximal level of care that patient needs at that time. And that's what you can do as an anesthesia provider.
Oh, that makes sense. And so whenever you were in that ICU setting, how do you feel like that contributed to like your knowledge towards going to CRNA school? Do you feel like, prior to like your application interviews, that gave you like good confidence going in, knowing that, when I apply, probably going to get an interview, probably going to get accepted? Like, what was kind of like your timeline, I guess, as far as applying to anesthesia school and your preparation for that?
Yeah, for sure. The minimal preparation for CRNAs is to go to ICU for a year. The national average is 3 years for people to have. A lot of folks skew towards cardiovascular or CT ICUs. cardiothoracic. So I was med surge the whole way. I think I don't know. I think I rotated over for like a day in a CVICU and like played with the external pacer and that kind of stuff. But all that stuff was kind of foreign to me. So,
Yeah.
but man, I had sepsis, respiratory failure, multi-system organ failure, CRRT, all that stuff, dialed in. And I would say, the ICU is it's a good stepping stone. It's solid real life experience that can definitely help you develop just that basic patient care experience for knowing how to move patients, knowing how to talk to and interact with patients, knowing, when someone is starting to crump, when vital signs are getting dicey, knowing what critical care looks like, what kind of support people need, how to string multiple vasopressors, antibiotics, other, IV medications, all that, in compatibility and getting those things going. All that can be very helpful background, tinkering with vent settings and that kind of stuff with the respiratory therapist. But at some point, you got to leave the ICU because, again, your knowledge base caps out at a certain level and you need to go deeper. You need to go further in and broaden that scope of knowledge. So it prepares you to a degree. But for me, I spent, almost 5 years in the ICU, and towards the end of that time frame, I was definitely thinking like it is time for me to move on. Like I'm not really learning a whole lot more. I'm the preceptor. I'm, someone who's educating other nurses on the floor. I've checked off all the merit badges. We did CCRN. I helped train a bunch of other people in CCRN, ACLS PALS instructor, BLS instructor, all the things,
Oh, nice.
Which was good. I think good prep in terms of like resume building. And as a SRNA clinical coordinator, someone who manages students in the clinical environment, I see a lot of the students who come in have kind of all of those merit badges, right? Like they have worked hard. They are a preceptor. They're a nurse educator. They've done quality improvement projects. And it's interesting. All that stuff helps you get to anesthesia school, but then you're right back at like the bottom rung of like novice, and you got to start that climb again towards expert again. So it's good prep, but at some point you just need to move on and get into anesthesia school, and it will really teach you what you need to know in order to become a CRNA.
That's an excellent point you bring up about, I've kind of experienced that myself from being kind of at like the top practice at the top of your license. And then all of a sudden starting like, for most people, even for all people, I suppose, you're starting a brand new profession. You're starting from like ground zero. And, some of like the basic principles, obviously, coincide with what you're learning, but there's just such a depth to, what you're learning in anesthesia school. It's just wildly different than, anything that you could really like prepare yourself for. So,
right. And I mean, you've got an amazing head start, I think, on a lot of folks as being you were an emergency medicine nurse practitioner for a long time. So that's got to be invaluable experience coming into anesthesia school.
It is. It's good. It's a very good experience. I think it prepared me well. There's a lot of overlap, but there's just so much that's wildly different about anesthesia, compared to even critical care medicine or emergency medicine. It's just like you're on a different planet sometimes. So that's, I can totally relate to like being back at that like ground zero level and trying to like, build it back up. So
yeah. I mean, this is your interview, dude, but I got all kinds of questions I could ask you about that journey, that context, all that stuff. I definitely want to hear more about that.
Absolutely. So as far as going to anesthesia school, did you have certain schools in mind whenever you started like planning, or like how did that, like what did that kind of look like for you?
I was a little lame. I had one school in mind, and it was Western Carolina University. And fortunately, I had gotten to know some of the professors that worked there. They were CRNAs that I worked with clinically. So I would receive patients from them. I would package up patients for them to go to the OR. So I always made sure that those interactions went really well. Some of the ICU staff that I worked with as critical care nurses ended up going to that same program. So I stayed in touch with them, but I was living in Asheville. I owned a house in Asheville. The wilderness medicine company I worked for was in Asheville. Honestly, all the creeks and rivers that I paddled in Whitewater were in Asheville. So the beer scene, the food scene, the mountains, the people, Asheville's pretty amazing. So I was a little lame in that regards. I did not like have this master plan of, scoping out all these schools, doing all these interviews, shipping off resumes to, a dozen schools or more, flying
Sure.
around the country for interviews. That first cycle, I put all the chips on WCU, and it was fear and trepidation, right? Going through the interview process. Fortunately, I got in the first year that I applied somehow, maybe by the skin of my teeth. I don't know. But I was thinking, I was like, if I don't get in to this school this first time that I apply, I
Yeah.
probably was going to do something like I just described, like really circle
Okay.
back, fan out, go big, diversify, think about moving. But
Yeah.
WCU was a phenomenal experience for me. I still recommend it to folks. I'm in touch, on an every couple month basis with the program director there, where we stay in touch. So I still think it's a really high quality program, and I've considered myself very fortunate to have gotten in there.
Nice. That's I've heard of that program, and it's got a good reputation. So that's awesome that you had like a good
Cool.
experience. So as far as you said, you had like your CCRN, obviously ICU experience, precepting, kind of all like the work related type stuff. At your point, like when you went to anesthesia school, did you go back and take like additional courses prior to your application, or what was kind of the environment for that whenever you were applying to anesthesia school? Because now
Yeah.
it's like a lot of places require like organic chemistry or biochemistry.
Right,
Kind of like talk about that a little bit. Did you have to go back and do
right,
anything different than
right,
what you
right,
already
right.
had at your preparation?
Yeah, it's a good question. So nursing was the second career for me. So my undergrad was in outdoor adventure leadership. So I took like none of the core science stuff. So to
Gotcha.
get into nursing school, I had to go back and do a year of prereqs, which were all the anatomy and physiology and
Right.
chemistry and medical ethics and all that kind of stuff. So, and then I kind of had my eye on the timeline. Like some of those courses you had to repeat if you were beyond 5 years out from taking them or something like that. So I was right at that cutoff for some of those courses. By the
Okay.
time I took those courses, I did accelerated, BSN for a year. So did prereqs, accelerated BSN, and then about 5 years of nursing school. So I was kind of getting to that point, right? I needed to hurry up and get this application in, or I was going to
Yeah.
have to start retaking some of those courses. But in terms of like special preparation for anesthesia school, I didn't
Yeah.
do anything. And looking back, I don't know if I would, recommend to go take a course per se.
Sure.
I would definitely recommend if you're an ICU nurse out there and you're listening to this, I would definitely recommend just paying attention more, asking questions, talking to the respiratory therapist. You
Yeah.
need to switch gears from being someone who follows protocols and order sets to someone who's evaluating clinical conditions and making decisions. So you need to be hanging out with like the critical care physicians, the emergency medicine FNPs, the decision makers on the units that you're in. Like, why are they switching the vent settings to that? Like, why are they adding that vasopressor versus this other one? A lot of IC nurses obviously understand those things, but you're going to
Yeah.
become the person making those decisions without someone else chirping in your ear to tell you what to do when you become a CRNA. So I would just say on your path, if you know anesthesia is what you want to get into, don't just meet the bar for like, what's an expert ICU nurse look like. You need to go beyond that and start thinking about like, what would it be like if I was the one making the decisions here? If I was the one having to critically think through the processes. And I do think a lot of ICU nurses operate on that level, and a lot of them end up going back to school, right? Because they want
Yeah.
that autonomy and latitude, like we talked about earlier, to just make those decisions.
Right. No, that's
But
an excellent
I
point.
didn't do
And
any yeah, I didn't do
yeah.
any special preps. I know there are. I think from even in the short time that I've been as a CRNA, there are probably way more resources in terms of support for people who are wanting to go to anesthesia school and how to prepare for school. So there are CRNAs out there now. I mean, I don't know if it's just the
Yeah.
internet or social media or it's just a new vibe of people trying to look back and bring others along with them. But I could name, half a dozen CRNAs right now that have businesses that have like the majority of their full-time work is focused on helping ICU nurses get into anesthesia school. So they're doing
Yeah.
interview prep, resume reviews, like mock interviews. They're coaching people on pathophysiology. They're pointing them to different resources that like you should definitely read through this textbook, know these questions, study this thing. And I
Yeah.
don't, either I have my head in a hole or head in a river. I don't know. I just wasn't paying attention or whatever. But I don't think that that level of support was available back when I was going to anesthesia school. And it's one of
Yeah.
the things that keeps me motivated about the podcast. Like I want to produce content that helps other people on that journey. So, and there are a bunch of other CRNAs out there who are doing similar things.
No, that makes total sense. And I agree with what you said. I graduated nursing school in 2012, and CRNA's kind of always been in my mind, something that I wanted to do. I originally started in pediatric emergency medicine as a nurse and kind of went down the ER rabbit hole. And that's not necessarily like conducive to anesthesia school. So I kind of like stuck that on the back burner. And but yeah, like the emergency medicine side of it was very helpful for me. But at that particular time, like you said, even when I was looking at it, there weren't that many like resources available
Yeah.
to like for people looking to go to anesthesia school. And even now, like in the past couple of years that I've really looked into this and started on my journey, there's so much out there that
Right.
wasn't available 7 or 8 years ago.
Yeah.
And that's super interesting, I feel like.
And I would say to people listening to, like, you don't necessarily need those resources. They're available. You don't
Right.
necessarily need to go read an anesthesia textbook ahead of time, but
Yeah.
if you did, I mean, I'm sure it would be helpful, but rest assured that I think most programs, when you hit the program, just get ready to like drink from a fire hose for 3 years straight. But they generally will either teach you or just expect for you to learn in that time zone everything that you need to know about anesthesia. So you can float into one, and as long as you're ready to just like lock lips with the fire hose and take it, you can get caught up to speed. So I don't think you necessarily need to go, like the flip side of the coin. Some people will say, don't study, don't do a prep, don't sign up for extra work, like spend the
Right.
time with your family, go on a vacation. Like they
Oh,
won't see you for
absolutely.
so
Yeah.
there's that like attitude out there as well.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. So going fast forwarding to when you're in anesthesia school, I know that's like a huge question, but like, how would you summarize your journey through CRNA school? Like, how is that for you? And obviously, that's like that a whole podcast could be spent on that simple question, but like the short, sweet version, how was CRNA school for you?
Yeah, for sure. Overall, it was an amazing experience. I feel like I got through by the skin of my teeth, actually. I was just actually writing this story up a little bit. I'm going to start a new series in the podcast talking about thriving in training. So I talk a little bit about like understanding your why and goal setting. And I share a little bit of my story, which is just to your question. So, when I went into anesthesia school, somebody told me, a CRNA that I really respected that I worked with out of the ICU, he said, you don't need to stress about getting a 4.0. Like, no one cares what your GPA is. No one cares what school you go to when you're on the other side. When you're a CRNA, you're a CRNA. You do cases like every other CRNA. No one's going to ask you questions about
Right.
your academic journey. So I was like, all right, yeah. He seemed like the smartest guy on the planet. And so I was like, cool. So I floated the
Yeah.
first semester, got straight B's, floated into the second semester, straight B average. And then I hit a wall. My personal story is that I was married for 8 years prior to anesthesia school, went through a separation and divorce in like 6 months in, and then found myself at this like point where I had floated academically for 2 semesters, took my eye off the ball the week that this like separation divorce process started happening, went
Okay.
into finals, got smashed by one of these finals because I just didn't study as I should have.
Yeah.
And then took a C letter grade in that course, ended up with a 2.9 GPA overall, which our program said, hey, you can get one letter grade C and you can continue. So I was like, all right, I'm cool. Like I took my hit and now I'm
Yeah.
gonna like I took my hit, my wife left. So now I'm gonna figure some stuff out. What I
Yeah.
didn't understand at that point, actually, it got worse, but I didn't understand at that point is that the graduate school had a policy that said if you drop below a 3.0, you lose all your financial aid.
Oh
You don't
no.
get federal loans.
Oh
I had
man.
neglected to read that line in the handbook, as
Yeah.
they tell you to enter. And so suddenly I was just like moping around between semesters, having like already got sucker punched by the, well, not sucker punched, it was totally my fault, but taking this C and then like going through this divorce separation thing. Then I get this letter in the mail from the financial aid department saying, you get no money for the fall. And
Yeah.
at that point I was
That's huge.
done. it was over. I mean,
Yeah.
I had no money saved. I had like my ex was my financial plan. So then I was sitting there between, the second and third semester, really at a super, super low point. Like one of the lowest lows, I think, just in my life that I probably have been in. And that was a turning point. It by the grace of I went to my program director. I was just writing about this morning, actually. I went to my program director and
Yeah.
like dried up my face from the tears and like went in there. I was like, dude, I'm out. Like, I have no money. I didn't realize this. I dropped the ball. Like I owned it. I took responsibility. And I
Yeah.
just went in as a formality to say, I appreciate the 2 semesters. Maybe if I can get my act together, I'll come back someday.
Yeah.
And he went out of his way and he wrote a letter to the financial aid department and said, our program allows people to get 1C. He
Wow.
is allowed to be in our program. If you'll release his financial aid, if you will make an exception for this scraggler, he vouched for me. He said, I'm sure that he will turn the tide around. And
Oh, wow. That's
I had
awesome,
about
man.
I had about a week there where my future was uncertain, and living out of the back of my truck and working as an outdoor guide again was looking pretty appealing. I was like, maybe I will be a full-time wilderness medicine instructor again. I was like, where am I
Hmm.
at in this whole mix? And at that point, I realized that, because all of like nursing school, all the decision to go to anesthesia school, all of that happened within the context of this previous relationship. And so
Okay.
at that point, it was, I mean, if there was ever like a coming home to Jesus moment, it was, as my mother would say, it
Yeah.
was that week in my life. And then the financial aid department made the exception. They released my federal loans. And I said, from that point forward, I'm not jacking around. Like whatever about this dude's advice that, B equals CRNA. And I buckled down and, never made another C, never made another B in the program.
Oh,
Straight A's
nice.
from then on out, hammering my way through, figured out ways to study, figured out ways to really dial the material in.
Yeah.
And really my whole life, I think, just shifted from that point. I started working out on a regular basis. I was like depressed, stressed out in a failing marriage. Things were not going well. And
Oh,
then
man.
like 2 semesters in, everything shifted and I ended anesthesia school probably in the best shape of my life.
Wow.
Uh, Rocking exams, totally stoked with my classmates. Met a girl in the program after all of the separation divorce thing went. She was someone who really was a little antisocial because she was so focused on anesthesia school.
Nice.
That girl ended up becoming my wife. So we are now,
Oh,
she's a
that's
CRNA.
awesome.
And
Oh, how
yeah,
cool.
so we have been married now for 7 years. Well, oh, I shouldn't hesitate on that. I'm getting mixed up with when did we married the same year we graduated. So 7 years.
Yeah. Nice.
Um, so it's been amazing, but really, I mean, so that's a very long, it's probably longer than what you were anticipating, but
That's
my journey
awesome.
through
That's an
school was
awesome story.
like float along and then get absolutely hammered and destroyed and then come
Yeah.
out of this like super dark place in my life to realize, no, this is something that I want. And I'm not going to jack around with this.
Yeah.
And then it's been on a path up really since then. So
Dude, that's an awesome story. And I think that says like two things that like speaks to your like stamina and drive. But I also think, like you said, going to your program director, I've just noticed even in my short, first quarter in anesthesia school, just how small and tight knit the anesthesia community really is.
yeah.
And I've seen that just on social media, in my program, just at kind of in the United States at large, of how tight knit anesthesia providers are. And I think that is a really cool thing to be able to join one day.
Yeah. Yeah. I would say this guy went out of his way for sure. I mean, I didn't, I didn't deserve that. It was
Sure,
squarely
sure.
there. I point to this guy's advice that I took, but the decisions I made, even in that, first relationship were on me. Like I take ownership for those things. And
Sure.
he did not need to go out of the way to support me in that way, but he did. And I would, not every program director is like that. Not every program faculty is like that in terms of
Yeah,
being supportive, but some of them are amazing. I would say most of them are amazing. But
absolutely.
that guy, I mean, I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing if he didn't go out of his way to try to, if he didn't believe in me and say, no, I want you in this program and I'm going to write this letter and I'm going to try to get you a second shot and don't blow it. And I was like,
Yeah.
poor dude, I'm so not dropping the ball the second time around.
That's awesome, man. So what would
Yeah.
be like your single most important piece of advice for somebody like applying to anesthesia school and then getting in and starting? What is like, if you could say like one thing, what would be like the number one thing you would tell somebody, like as far as advice and being prepared and succeeding? Like what would you say your piece of advice would be?
Man, I was hoping you would string that question on a little bit longer, give me some more time to think about it. I would just say strap in, go big. Like you
Yeah,
gotta, it is a really, really hard path. And it really
sure.
comes down to, knowing your why. Like you need to know, like anesthesia school is so difficult. It's so challenging for people to get into. It's really hard to describe. I mean, you were a emergency medicine nurse practitioner, and you're talking about how difficult it is to be
Yeah,
in the program. So
absolutely.
it's hard to describe how challenging it is. And I think if you really understand why do you want to be there, where are you headed, what does the payoff mean for you, what's the passion that got you into anesthesia school, and
Yeah,
then what's going to keep you going. For me, it was that interest of saying I want to stand in those moments where the poo-poo's hitting the fan and I want to make a difference for patients in the middle of their worst days. I want to be in those moments and help those
yeah,
people. And that's what got me into anesthesia school. That's what led me through all the prep, all the years of ICU, all that kind of stuff. But then when I hit bottom, that was still there, but it had to, like, there was another why that surfaced. And it was this:
yeah,
I'm going to do this for myself. I'm going to claw my way forward and make this happen, because I'm not going to drop this ball. I'm not going to, I don't know, I'm not going to embarrass myself. I'm not going to embarrass the people who supported me to get here. And it just became, and it wasn't just about, not embarrassing people, but it really became a
yeah,
personal drive to say, I'm going to prove to myself that I can figure this out, that I don't have to float along with like an average, mastery of this content, that I can really lock this down and keep going. So it became a very personal goal of mine to kind of get through. So I think you just need to know your why, because it's going to be a hard road. Whether you struggle as
yeah,
much as I did or not, it's going to be a hard road no matter what. So
yeah,
just think
absolutely.
about, why do you want to be there, and keep that going, because you're going to have some really long weeks, some really long days. And it's just because you get into a program, it's not guaranteed that you're going to get through to the other side. And in those moments of doubt, you need something to fall back on. And that's got to be that burning reason as to why am I here?
No, I 100% agree. The why, even for me, like on my like, yeah, I have rough days. Some days that I'm like, is this worth it? Like, should I be doing this? And it really comes back to the why. I completely agree with that.
Yeah. Like
Um,
for an example, I went to school with a guy who had his wife had their fourth kid right
wow.
before he started the program, had their
Oh
fifth
man,
kid during the program.
that's
And
nuts.
this dude was he was like a mad scientist. He has these like little like dark glasses and a scraggly beard. And his name was Jason. And every time I saw him, I was like, Jason, what's up, dude? How you doing? And he would just like have this nervous laughter. He's like, ha ha ha, like he didn't even know where to start because his life was just so chaotic. We never
Yeah,
saw him out of the bars. We never saw him like, he was so laser focused. But when you really talk to him, he was like, failure is not an option. Like my
yeah.
wife is a stay-at-home wife caring for like 18-month-old, a newborn, and three other kids.
Wow,
I am my family's like life raft. Like anesthesia school will work out.
it's
And
gotta
that
happen.
dude, he put the work in. He did what he needed to do I mean,
Wow,
that was his why. And like there was no getting in his way. He was super motivated.
that's nuts, man. Okay, so switching gears just a bit here. I came to know about you through your podcast, so Anesthesia
Oh, cool.
Guidebook, and I delved into the podcast world in critical care and emergency medicine. Never really overlapped with anesthesia until recently. I started anesthesia school, and I ran into your podcast. That's how I came to know of you, and you have some amazing content. Totally
Oh, thanks.
recommend if anybody's out there listening to this, like go check out Anesthesia Guidebook. Like, got some really good pearls of wisdom, not only for the anesthesia community, but I really think for critical care and other providers in general. And so
Cool.
with that being said, kind of tell me a little more about your like social media journey with Anesthesia Guidebook and with Head of the Bed before that, and kind of how that got started. And I guess like what's kind of your vision for that going forward?
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, man. So for me, the impetus was, my 30-minute commute in and out of Asheville, North Carolina, from where I lived out in the sticks, and as a critical care nurse. And back in the day, when podcasts like became a thing, the only people that I really found doing stuff that was interesting had to do with critical care and emergency medicine. So folks like
Yeah.
the Society for Critical Care Medicine, Scott Weingart with MCRIT, Life in the Fast Lane. There were some people out there who were producing amazing content. And that's really, I mean, you asked earlier, like, how did I prepare for anesthesia school? I listened to anything I could to try to
Yeah.
sharpen my knowledge base and expand my knowledge. And a lot of it was coming out of the emergency medicine world. Even though I was in a med surg ICU, I listened to all the airway stuff as much
Yeah.
as I could. So once I got into anesthesia school, as you know, everyone has to pick a project or a paper to focus on. And for me, I got this idea that I wanted to create an anesthesia podcast, a podcast focused on anesthesia providers, because it's a little bit of a different flavor. The way that we think about vasopressors, the way we think about airway management, the way we think about vent settings, and the goals of what we're doing when we're doing like episodic care. You got to intubate someone, manage their ventilation status for X amount of minutes or hours till the case is over, and then we're planning on extubating that person. So it's a different way of thinking about things than managing people in an emergency room. You do that. You do the trauma surgeries. You do the emergency cases. You do this, the stroke clot retrievals and that kind of stuff. The emergent cranies and all that. The heart attacks in cath lab. We're involved in those cases, but we also do all this other stuff in terms of different types of anesthesia and surgeries and whatever. So at the time, there really wasn't anyone who was actively producing podcast content that focused just on anesthesia providers. So I figured if I could sell this to my university to say, hey, we want to do this, we want to start a podcast, maybe they would get behind it. So from the Head of the Bed was a collaboration with three other providers, three other anesthesia students that I was involved with. So there were four of us. And we wrote a paper on social media and nurse anesthesia education. So we did this, everyone had to write a paper. And then the project of actually launching this podcast was just extra. So they let four of us work on it together, which was a first for the graduate school. They had a rule for whatever reason that only two people could work on one paper or project, but we convinced them through our charm and dashing good looks or just our plan to let us have four people to work on this. So we wrote a paper, ultimately got published in the AANA journal. So it was a lit review on social media use in nurse anesthesia education. And then we launched this podcast. I think we started with 20 something shows. So we were conducting interviews in school as SRNAs. And right before we graduated, we launched From the Head of the Bed. And right after school, everyone else dipped out. One of the people that was on the show is my wife, actually. And
Oh, how
so
funny.
she was in on the show from the get-go and a co-author on the paper. And since she has also dipped off the podcast. But so she thinks. She is actually by far like the shadow producer, the shadow editor. She's really no active involvement in the show other than just listening to me talk about it all the time and graciously giving me time to do stuff like this while she's managing our 8-month-old baby. So,
oh, man.
So she's definitely the biggest support that I've had on the whole process. But yeah, the other folks kind of dipped off, and to me, it was something that I still feel like, I don't know, 7 years in, that I feel like I'm just getting going with.
Nice.
So there's so much that I want to do with the show. Anesthesia Guidebook, the name change, I would definitely recommend if you ever start a social media platform, don't run it for 4 or 5 years and then switch the name. It's a huge pain in the butt. But, for me, From the Head of the Bed was always kind of confusing to start a proper name with the word from. You're like, oh, yeah, the guy from the Head of the Bed, So Anesthesia Guidebook was a subtle shift in philosophy, maybe really more for me, of just saying that, I wanted it to feel I wanted it to be like a guidebook. I wanted it to be like a Lonely Planet guide, like here's what you need for your journey in anesthesia. I wanted it to be a resource for anesthesia trainees, not just SRNAs, but anesthesia physician residents as well. And I want it to be relevant to practicing clinicians. And again, not just CRNAs, but physician anesthesiologists as well. And it's also an excuse for me to interview really interesting people and to get their stories and to, basically share that with the rest of the world. So yeah, so my vision for the future is definitely, continue to produce content, continue to grow this thing. I've never had money making as like the point. So there's been opportunities to make money off of it. It's not a huge moneymaker for sure. It's definitely still hobby status. I'm a full-time practicing CRNA. Like my full-time job is going to do anesthesia at a level 1 trauma center. And so the podcast is definitely still like hobby status for me, which, I look at people who are able to do their shows as their job, and it's really interesting. I mean, it's amazing. People that kick out a show per week or even more. To me, quality is always super important. So I'm not going to meet that, a show per week unless I've got the content that's actually worthwhile to put out there. But I definitely see this thing continuing to grow moving forward.
That's awesome, man. That's really cool. It's cool how it started, and even
Yeah.
more cool, kind of going back to what you said, that you were published in AANA as an SRNA. Like that's awesome.
Yeah,
So
technically we were CRNAs by the time. I mean, journal
by the time it
publication
came
is a
out, yeah,
slow process, which is another reason why I think this
yeah,
medium of, YouTube channels and
yeah,
podcasts is so interesting, because it shortens that time window down for when you are able to produce something and get it out to people. It obviously brings on the element of quality control in like truth and like real information, because anyone can get on and spew anything that they want.
sure,
And there's a platform for that, right? We've been seeing that recently with Joe Rogan and Spotify. I mean, I love Rogan. I listen to
yeah,
his show. I think he's got super interesting ideas. But when you're not doing, some sort of filtering or quality control, you can run into issues, especially if it's some sort of a medical based platform. So for
oh,
me, when I
absolutely,
just got started, I was really cautious about putting out content like from Jon. I really wanted to identify
yeah,
other people who had lots more of experience than me to speak about complex topics. And as I've grown, I think I've come into myself a little bit more. I'm more experienced as a clinician, as an SRNA clinical coordinator, but I still keep my wheelhouse within my own zone of kind of expertise, and I'm looking for other
yeah.
people to contribute on their areas of expertise.
Yeah, that makes sense. After listening to like some of your episodes, I ran across several episodes that deal with like mental health and like
Oh yeah.
well-being and provider burnout, that sort of thing. Is that something you like have taken an interest in, or kind of talk to me about that? What are your thoughts on like the like mental health of healthcare providers in general, burnout? That's kind of like a very broad general question, but so
Sure.
what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and it's great. Yeah, it's an interest of mine. I think part of it comes out of my own journey through anesthesia school and experiencing that super low point and
Sure.
realizing that that other people experience similar things. And as I've worked as a clinical coordinator, I've seen just horrific experiences that anesthesia students go through, everything from having to get restraining orders against partners to being victims of sexual abuse and rape, academic struggles, financial struggles, personal health care struggles in terms of cancer and surgery, and just the whole gamut of the being a human. The human experience doesn't go on hold so that you can go to grad school and become a CRNA. So like
Yeah.
all of your life continues, and it can
Oh
be a
yeah.
really challenging road. And I think honestly, I mean, whether it's like a way to help people, kind of thrive in their programs, uh, or I think it's really just, general advice for being human. I think when we look at like,
Yeah.
how do you optimize your well-being as a person, you have to take your personal wellness into accord, so one of the things I go back to over and again, and I'm planning a podcast right now with a couple of SRNAs talking about the 6 dimensions of your wellness, which comes from the National Wellness Institute. They talk
Huh.
about things like, I don't know if I can rattle off all of them without thinking about it, but your physical well-being, emotional, social, occupational, which covers your financial, uh, your spiritual well-being, and something else. I don't know. I can't remember all of
Yeah,
them, but
sure.
it's really recognizing that we are all, we are multidimensional human beings. It's not all just occupational. And I know, I don't know. Some people would say all that stuff is kind of fluff, and I just want like podcasts on pharmacology. But I really think if
Yeah,
you want to operate at your highest level, and going back to my passion, if you want to be that person that can stand in the moment when, you know, the proverbial shit is hitting the fan, and you want to be calm, cool, and collected, and have expertise and not be a jerk, in those moments, you
yeah,
need to have some sense of wellness that you're bringing to your job day in and day out. You need to have balance on the outside of whatever you're doing at work as much as you do expertise when you're at work. So that's a little bit of the philosophy behind it. I would say my personal
yeah,
experience in anesthesia school with my these was impactful. We also were going to be the first class at our university to have all of our SRNAs graduate. They had always had someone from they were about a 10-year-old school when we started, and no class had ever made it everyone in, everyone out. So that actually
yeah.
became our mantra of
Oh, nice.
16 in, 16 out. That was going to be our goal. We were going to unite and carry
Yeah,
all of us through it. And kind of the very first week of anesthesia school, they brought in, near and dear to my heart from an outdoor education world, they brought in some group like team dynamics, teamwork coaches, and they had a day with us where we did like group dynamics activities and
yeah.
team building activities. And one of the things they said that day, I'll never forget, they said, "You've made it into anesthesia school. The competition is over. You all need to come together and figure out a way to support one another." And they kind of helped solidify that goal. Like, everyone here today, and we hadn't taken no tests. There was no, there's no attrition the first week of school. Like, everyone here today is going to make it out on the other side. You'll be the first class in this university's history to
Oh,
make
that
it
is
out.
cool.
So that became our mantra. And, coming back in, not to get crazy heavy on your question, but, one of our classmates ended up committing suicide during
Oh,
our
wow.
program. And she had a personal difficulty that she was going through, and no one saw warning signs. No one had the opportunity to intervene. She was
Oh, wow.
bright, performing excellently in anesthesia school, loved by her professors, her preceptors. Everything was going great. She was
Oh,
an
wow.
identical twin, super close to her twin, super close to her mother, and just made a horribly bad choice. Diverted medications took her life. And so
Oh, wow.
recognizing that, having like our whole program going through that experience has also kind of just seared into my mind the importance of focusing on provider wellness for trainees and also practicing providers.
Oh, absolutely. That's huge. And I couldn't imagine having to go through something like, especially as a pro, even in my program, we're very close and very cohesive. And that's one thing I find completely different than really any other area of medicine that you study, is like the closeness and the cohesiveness and the lack of competition. I can like resonate with that. But I really couldn't imagine like losing somebody along the way like that, even like a classmate. That would just be horrible. And
Yeah, it
something
was,
that would be
it
very
was,
traumatic, I feel like.
it was, and a lot of people dealt with it in different ways,
Yeah.
from the program faculty to the students and her family. We have memorial services, and she loved to hike. We did a big memorial hike for her. And
Oh, wow.
and since then, I had a physician anesthesiologist colleague who was at the top of his game, beloved. He was the director of simulation for our whole health system. We've got an amazing simulation center here in Portland, Maine, and he grant funded the whole building and spearheaded the whole, orchestration of the thing. Um, Succumbed to ongoing mental health concerns. That was people were aware of it. His family was aware of it. He was in therapy, and he also made a tragic choice and took his life.
Oh, that's horrible.
Was reached out to, I don't know, a year ago, and SRNA took her life. I think she had been caught in somewhere in North Carolina, had been caught diverting medications from the clinical
Wow.
environment just to deal with chronic pain, and pretty close to being done with school. And I think just the
Oh, man.
weight, I don't know what the details were. If she was, told that she was going to be out of the program, or just
Yeah.
the embarrassment of it all. But her roommate reached out to me and had heard some of the similar podcasts, from Anesthesia Guidebook,
Sure.
and
Sure.
wanted to talk in the immediate aftermath of that. So, suicide, depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation, these are things that are not uncommon in healthcare, and definitely not uncommon in anesthesia. The rates of diversion in anesthesia, I mean, I can't remember, some studies show it as high as like 30% amongst anesthesia
Wow.
providers, which is crazy. I mean, it's
Oh yeah.
crazy. I look at the 100 CRNAs that I work with and I'm like, no way, no
Yeah.
way anybody
Right.
here has
Oh,
that
that's
kind of issue.
nuts.
But those things live in the shadows, And so I think
Yeah.
unless we're talking about it, people won't know that help is available, and that it's normal to get help for mental health concerns. It's not something that you need to, you know, struggle with on your own. You can reach out and get help.
I completely agree. I think it's so stigmatized today, obviously, and this is like obviously going down a rabbit hole, but we could spend hours
For
talking about
sure.
that. That's just
Well, did you see this?
it's
You see
wild.
this for years as a emergency medicine nurse
Oh yeah,
practitioner. This is like, I don't know what
absolutely.
portion of your pie, but it's a pretty big portion of your pie, I would imagine, of people coming in with
Yeah,
mental health concerns.
yeah. Mental health issue. It's a huge portion of the population that shows up for mental health issues, and historically they go underserved, and they are impoverished and homeless and extremely difficult people at baseline to deal with, and which makes it even more difficult to get them to the appropriate resources. And I think
Yeah.
that's we see that in everyday working environments, but whenever you think about, oh, in my own anesthesia program or in my own workplace, you at least in my brain it's like that, that doesn't happen, but in reality it absolutely does. And I think
Well,
that's,
and
you're
we
right, we
have
have
this
to talk
vibe.
about it.
Yeah, we have this vibe, right? I think, as you said, it's a stigmatization just about mental health in general in the United States. But certainly, you look at a subset of like high performing healthcare providers who are on a track to become nurse
Oh yeah.
practitioners, physician anesthesiologists, CRNAs. You're not supposed to have any of that stuff. Like, you're not
Right.
supposed to struggle. You're just supposed to have your stuff together and dial it in and don't complain, put your head down and just get to work.
Yeah.
And that can be something that helps pull you through, but you may also need some help along the way, for sure.
No, absolutely. I completely agree. Any suggestions on how to like cope with that or how to deal with that? And I really think for me personally, it would come back to asking for help. Like what are your
Yeah.
thoughts on that?
Yeah, for sure. Ask for help. I mean, I think that, as we were just talking about, I think most program directors and program faculty are not naive to the struggles that SRNAs go through. And you may not be someone who is thinking that you're going to have some sort of a stress crisis or issue that comes up, but I think asking for help, you will often be surprised that you actually get help. Like people are willing to support
Yeah.
you. People are willing to, you know, make accommodations for you to, I don't know, reschedule that test or
Yeah.
cycle around again. I'm working with an SRNA right now who had some physical health concerns that came up that derailed her participation in a semester of school. So her program has set her up as best she could. She was like literally in the hospital for a period of weeks, and then
Well,
missed some key dates for classes, so she was able to finish those up at another time, basically take a semester off and come back and keep going. I've heard other SRNAs that they have to drop out, and but they're guaranteed to join the next class. Like, they don't have to go through the admission and interview process again.
yeah.
They'll get a slot in the class behind them. So sometimes you need to take a year off to deal with breast cancer, chemo radiation surgery, or,
Sure.
whatever it is. And I think what I would encourage right off the bat is, don't hesitate to ask for help. It doesn't have to be at your school.
Yeah.
There's resources through the American Association of Nurse Anesthesiology that are free and available. They have a plethora of information on their website. So aana.com, that's geared towards SRNAs, towards mental health, including free counseling lines. But a lot of universities also have those programs available through counseling. And maybe you're not thinking like, maybe you're thinking I don't need therapy or counseling or whatever.
Yeah.
If it's something that your clinical faculty can help you with, or your academic
Absolutely.
faculty,
Yeah.
don't hesitate to ask for help. You would be amazed that people are usually pretty willing to give it.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. Kind of
Yeah, thanks
switching,
for asking about it.
yeah, absolutely. Switching gears here right towards the end. Um, I see that you have like a professional interest. You've talked a little bit about wilderness medicine. I would love to hear like a little bit more about that. I think that's definitely something that we share for the
Cool.
people that watch this. I probably know that for the past 4 to 5 years, I've primarily worked in wilderness medicine. I've practiced in some of the most remote parts of Alaska as a solo provider, and it's been probably one of the best experiences of my life. But I would love to
That's
hear
awesome.
some of your experiences in wilderness
Oh yeah.
medicine and kind of what that means for you.
So catch me up to speed real quick. So you were emergency medicine nurse practitioner, but you're working in rural Alaska. Like what's a little bit more of that story?
Yeah,
And then I'll
so
totally answer your question.
no, I got you. So I started out as a nurse practitioner working in emergency medicine. I did hospital based trauma and emergency medicine for about 3 years. Decided at that point, really mental health wise, I was like, I don't want to have a full time job at this point. I really need to kind of take my life in a different direction, do something different. I looked into locums, and I ran across a staffing company that just staffed remote areas in Alaska. And I love outdoors. I mean, just out, find me on a trail or in the mountains any day. And I was like, I need to look into that. And so I looked into it, and the places I've worked have been very small clinics. The closest hospital is usually a medevac away, 3 to 4 hours away. And so you really deal with whatever just pops in the door. And most of the time, it's easy stuff. They do have,
Yeah.
sometimes you're solo provider, sometimes you're not. There's usually full-time providers that deal with primary care issues. They hire locums to come in to deal with urgent care emergency issues. And so you really get anything from a stubbed toe to a crashing respiratory patient that you have to intubate and
Yeah.
everything in between. And so that's kind of primarily where I've worked over the past 4 to 5 years. I'll fly up and work a month or two at a time and then come back home to Texas. And so that's kind of where I was prior to my anesthesia journey. And I love wilderness medicine. It's fascinating. You have limited resources, and you got to do a lot with a little. And I think it's a really cool part of the job. It's much different than working in level one trauma center or even a community hospital where you have CT at your fingertips and lab and six
Yeah,
nurses there waiting to help you. I mean, it's a world in its own, and
for
that's
sure.
it's kind of where I've been at for the past several years. So
Oh man, that's gonna serve you so good in anesthesia school.
yeah, I hope so.
It'd be awesome.
Yeah.
You'd be like, this is so easy. Table up. Would you hold the mask? Thanks. That's awesome, dude.
I
Yeah.
remember my first time intubating a patient in Alaska, and it was me and a paramedic. And I was like, after I'm done, I like pulled the stylet and I'm like, okay, where's respiratory to like secure the tube? And everybody's kind of like looking around like, oh, okay, I got to do
You
it
are
myself. So
respiratory, buddy.
yeah, yeah, it's wild.
That's awesome. Yeah, that's good experience, dude. Yeah, so my path in wilderness medicine really comes from like the outdoor recreation background. So
Okay,
my first degree was in outdoor recreation and took that wilderness first responder course, which is the 9-day training for lay people. It's an introduction, like, how do you think about patient assessment,
sure.
traumatic injuries, medical emergencies, environmental emergencies, and then put that together into a 9-day package where you have some skills to work with. So that's really
Nice.
my first start in actually thinking about healthcare and medical stuff. So, and then I quickly became an EMT and started teaching in those programs. So a lot of those programs, I would say
Nice.
probably 80 to 90% of our clientele who are taking wilderness medicine classes are coming from some sort of an outdoor recreation background, whether they're trip leaders, trip guides, whitewater rafting guides, that kind of stuff. We're just outdoor enthusiasts. They work with the Boy Scouts, the Girl
Nice.
Scouts, a college outing club, or some sort of program where they're just folks that love to backpack, climb, hike, raft, whatever, and
Yeah.
they want to know how to put people back together in remote settings. I love
Nice.
actually when we do our wilderness medicine courses that are focused on for healthcare providers, because you'll get operating room nurses or ER
Yeah.
nurses or PAs, physicians, surgeons, even. I can remember one wilderness first aid class I taught, which is a 2-day, like super introductory basic course. I taught this in Nashville, and I had a critical care pulmonologist and I think like nephrologist or something in the course. And I'm like, guys, but they were there with like, one was there with his son, one was there with his wife who really enjoyed hiking. And they're
Okay.
like, we're all ears, man. And I'm like, oh, I was so nervous to, critical care
Yeah.
physician. What am I going to tell this guy? So yeah, so a lot of it is just focused on outdoor recreation. So I work with the
Nice.
Knowles Wilderness Medicine. So people may know that as the National Outdoor Leadership School.
Nice.
I've taught with them for a long time. We teach from 2-day wilderness first aid courses up to 30-day wilderness EMT courses. And that's really kind of the bulk of what I did professionally before and even during as I was working as a registered nurse. I taught a lot more courses back then. Still have connections and affiliations with that company and another one called Landmark Learning, who administers all of Knowles Wilderness Medicine courses throughout the Southeast.
Nice.
But yeah, it's mainly teaching these courses that are a planned curriculum and helping other folks gain those skills to deal with stuff if it comes up in a remote setting. When you can't call 911, you've got delayed, transport, extended patient care, limited resources, but for those who are like, wilderness medicine, what's that? It's all Western medicine based, like
Yeah.
philosophy of intervention. So we're not doing like plant identification or which like
Right.
leaves to smash up or which
Sure.
mushrooms eat for analgesic. Like it's none of that stuff.
Sure.
It's all like you have a fracture or you have a pulmonary embolus or altitude sickness or a heart attack, and you're in a
Yeah.
remote setting where you can't call 911 and you only have the gear that's in your backpack.
Yeah.
What are you going to do to manage that situation? So judgment, decision making, all that kind of stuff comes into play. But yeah, and then my personal wilderness medicine experience has all been like outdoor recreation trip based stuff. So it's like bebopping down, some class 4 or 5 whitewater run
Oh yeah.
and dealing with like dislocated shoulders or possible spinal injuries or,
Yeah.
backpacking where you've got like minor sprains, strains, cuts, bruises, burn injuries from working with camp stoves and that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And managing groups in remote settings, which is a lot of prevention, right? Like when you got
Sure.
a team of people and you're on an extended backpacking trip, you're not looking to use your skills. You're looking to prevent that stuff. You don't want
Yeah,
to like
absolutely.
a 12-hour litter carry back to the trailhead is not something that we're like hoping happens. We're trying to prevent
Yeah.
those things.
It seems like much like anesthesia as well. Prevention is key. It saves you those fires in the operating room.
Oh, for sure. For sure.
Yeah. All right, John. Well, I really appreciate you joining me today.
Yeah.
This has been like such a gem, and
Oh, cool, man.
I really appreciate it. So I'm gonna go ahead and stop the
Yeah. It's
recording
fun chatting
now.
with you.
Thank you guys so much for watching. It was such a pleasure to interview John and to get to know a little more about him. Go check out his podcast. It's Anesthesia Guidebook. You can listen to it on Apple or on Spotify or really wherever you get your podcast. He has some awesome anesthesia related content, and I know that you won't be disappointed by that. Thank you so much for watching. Consider subscribing here if this is content you like. I do plan to have differing guests on at sporadic times throughout the year to talk about things like this, to talk about their experiences in healthcare and what that looks like for their particular profession. So thanks so much for joining, and I'll see you next time.